of Talk Time. I am Paranjoy Bhuvathakurta in the studio of Lok Sabha Television here in the UK. In this edition of the program, we are going to discuss whether international humanitarian organizations are as humanitarian, as philanthropic as they claim to be, or do these international organizations replicate oppressive structures of power and authority, the very, very same structures they also claim to be opposed to? Let me welcome the guests who are here with me in the studio. I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Sreeram Chaulia. He's the author of this book, this recently published book, which is called International Organizations and Civilian Protection. And the subtitle reads, Power, Ideas and Humanitarian Aid in Conflict Zones, based on his research in various parts of the world, including Sri Lanka and the Philippines. Thank you, Professor Sreeram Chaulia, and for the information of our viewers. You are also the vice dean of the Jindal School of International Affairs, which is part of the O.P. Jindal Global University, Sonipat in Haryana. Thank you for coming here. With us here is an old friend of mine, Vijay Basant Patro, former colleague in the Pioneer newspaper, journalist, but who has now worked with various international organizations, notably the International Federation of the Red Cross, who's worked in almost each country in South Asia, and who is a commentator on development issues, on humanitarian issues. Thank you so much, Vijay, for coming here. Professor, if I can just ask you to summarize the main book. I know it's a very, very detailed book, and you've done a lot of research on it. But why do you actually argue, if you can summarize the principal argument in your book, that despite the proliferation of international humanitarian organization, human rights laws for now, since 1940, the last few decades, let me put it this way, why has there been an erosion in the practical immunity that civilians who are caught in armed conflicts, why do they face? And then why do you argue that these organizations, these international humanitarian organizations, are not successful in really helping who they want to support, because they have internalized certain oppressive, perhaps exploitative structures?
Well, you've already summarized it, Paranjoy, but briefly speaking, the argument of the book is that we are facing increasingly anti-civilian ideologies proliferating in war zones, and these have to do with breakdown of norms and laws in these peripheral regions where war has become almost a free-for-all, and where you have concepts like total war that emerged out of World War II and have gone on to become very, very violent, to the point that it's a no-holds bar. And all the laws and the normative principles we're talking about at the UN missions and at the level of the levels of national capitals and in sophisticated bourgeois settings break down when you actually go and look at war naked, face to face. And the book is basically saying that civilians have become the most vulnerable actors in war, far more than they were 50 years ago, and the statistics back it up. And the argument is that in this situation, the entire onus of the international community and its effort should be on protecting civilians rather than anything else in a war zone. We are not talking about normal developing country scenarios here. We are talking about developing countries primarily which have been beset by prolonged armed conflict, in which the civilian is at the receiving end of so much violence, abuse, intimidation, torture, abduction, disappearance, and of course assassination and massacre. So in this situation, my argument is that we need to go back to the logic of civil and political rights.
Professor Sreeram Chaulia, your opening line the introduction to your book, you quote Saint Augustine saying, "Charity is no substitute for justice withheld." Fast forward to Bob Marley and Peter Tosh, who says, "Everybody is talking about peace, none is crying out for justice." Do you really believe, as you have written right up front, that the landscape of charity in the contemporary world is inhabited by a recognizable form of channelizing donations to the needy, the humanitarian organization? In a sense, individuals and countries, developed countries, are literally trying to clear their guilt, their conscience, so to say, by providing so-called humanitarian aid. They're the nice guys, they're the benevolent givers, they're the philanthropists. And the people who are supposed to be receiving them should be grateful because they're desperate, they're in danger. But actually it never works that way.
In fact, if you look at the case like Sudan, if you look at Darfur last 6 or 7 years, Bush administration designated it as genocide. Didn't do very much about it. And in fact, the record shows that the Bush administration was benefiting from intelligence cooperation with the Sudanese military regime to counter Al-Qaeda. So here you have a situation where they have all these elaborate schemes and methods through which aid is being delivered to civilians who are caught in the armed conflict. But at the same time, there is militarization of this region and the society through pumping in weapons as well as through propping up dictatorial regimes. So on one hand you give and with the other hand you kill. And this is the kind of contradiction I'm trying to bring out with a number of donor states. In this book, we will see both with the Philippines and with Sri Lanka, how be it Australia, be it Canada, be it the United States, be it Britain, and in the case of Sri Lanka, even direct donors and patrons like China and India, what they have done is they have done the rhetorical talk about protecting civilians and about adhering to human rights. But at the same time, they have used these conflicts to strengthen certain actors who are prone to violence and prone to impunity and have actually sheltered them from international censure.
So, okay, in other words, what you're saying that they've actually not solved the problem.
There is a political economy of war going on here. And that aid is just one component of this larger frame.
We here in the studio of Lok Sabha Television, the author of this recently published book, it's called International Organizations and Civilian Protection, Power, Ideas and Humanitarian Aid in Conflict Zones, containing case studies of what happened in Sri Lanka and Philippines. I have Dr. Sreeram Chaulia here, studied at Delhi University, Syracuse, at Oxford, London School of Economics, and now the Vice Dean of the Jindal School of International Affairs at the O.P. Jindal Global University at Sonipat. With us here is Bijoy Basant-Patro, writer, commentator on humanitarian issues, has worked with the International Federation of the Red Cross, worked all over South Asia, a journalist as well. Professor Chaulia, when you really say here that those who dispense aid, they have certain conspicuous emblems, the way they dress, their uniforms, they have these inventories of food and medicines and plastic tents and transportation equipment. At one level, they are trying to constantly remind the world, so to say, how concerned we are of those who are in conflict zones, those who are in the midst of ethnic warfare, whose lives have been devastated. And they have these plentiful stocks of essential items which they want to give to the poor. But do they really benefit those who they wish to? Do they act as true philanthropists, selfless, other selfless? Or do they end up working on behalf of certain vested interests? Do they end up, at one level trying to clear their conscience, they have a moral impulse to save lives, but they also end up, influencing the politics, the political economy of these areas? Kindly explain how this actually operates. How does this actually work?
Yeah, scholars and commentators have coined phrases like lords of poverty, lords of death,
barons of morality, poverty pimps,
all these. I think the reason we have these rather pungent terminologies is because what you have in a war zone is a vacuum where civilian administration and law and order have collapsed. So in this vacuum come these Toyota driving and goggle wearing, the entire, it's a subculture, as you've just explained. And they have a certain way of doing things which are inherited from their predecessors and from the institution. There's an institutional culture, and I've delved a lot into organizational culture of specific aid agencies. But the point is that what they do then is essentially establish some kind of humanitarian order of their own, with their own rules, and which the populace are expected to follow, and to, of course, they can be denied aid if they are not conforming, for example, to settlement patterns that the aid agency wants them to conform to. They can be denied aid, or sometimes it's also the case where you have situations, total breakdown of law and order, where humanitarians themselves behave as if there is trophies to be looted in a war zone. And so you have sexual opportunism, financial opportunism, and so much more that goes on the ground by personnel of aid agencies themselves. And this is documented.
So the benefactors become the oppressors. Those
with the liberal veneer, as opposed to armed actors who are either the states or the guerrillas, who have hardly anything liberal in their ethos, because they say that they are fighting a life or death battle, and where their demands are much more crude and harsher. But what I'm trying to say is that even though this is wrapped up in the language of saving lives and of saving humanity, what they actually do is become part of the power structure.
Okay, I'll tell you what. We'll take one more break in our program. Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, Vijay Basant Patro, we'll take a break. Let's look at specific cases. I want you to talk a little bit about what happened in Sri Lanka. What happened in the Philippines, in the Mindanao island of the Philippines. I want you to talk about what exactly happened in those places. And then we can discuss some of the bigger philosophical issues where he's touched upon in this book, the issues of morality and might, and the issues of, what really, and how sometimes these end up being two sides of the same coin. So let's discuss some of these issues. We'll be back with you in a short while from now. We are discussing the role of international humanitarian organizations in conflict zones. The same people who say they're philanthropists end up oppressing those who they ostensibly go to assist. That's the issue we're discussing. We'll be back with you. And whether or not they're really benefiting those they claim to be benefiting. With me here is Professor Sreeram Chaulia. He is Vice Dean of the Jindal School of International Affairs at the O.P. Jindal University. And we have Vijay Basant Patro, writer, journalist on humanitarian and development-related issues. Formerly used to work with the International Federation of the Red Cross. Dr. Chaulia, you have personally been to Sri Lanka, you've personally been to the Philippines. Talk about your experiences in Sri Lanka. We've heard terrible stories, we've seen these documentary films which are ghastly, these are blood-curdling, of the last days of the war against the LTTE, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Nadu, by the Sri Lankan army. These horrific images have been shown on television. But in Sri Lanka, it's often been said that the bad guys, the real oppressors, were the army. They were the people who committed genocide. They were the people who committed mass rape. But the people who really stood out against